Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 102 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where tonight, well, instead of Barliman's common room, we've got ourselves a nice quiet table in the back of the Bird and Baby in Oxford, and all the Inklings are coming.
And we'll join the party in the common room in just a moment, folks. My name is Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the Man of the West, the Gawain to my Lancelot, I guess, only because he loves alliterative poetry and I speak a little French, Alan Sisto.
Well, you speak a little more French than I do. Folks, today we are proud to welcome Sørina Higgins to the podcast. Sørina's a writer, poet, teacher, and Inkling scholar, apparently because there's enough time in the world to do all those things, who also serves as the chair of the Department of Language and Literature at Signum University. She's also the editor of the new book, and it's a 2018 Mythopoeic Scholarship Award winner for Inkling Studies, The Inklings and King Arthur, which we'll be talking about today.
She's also edited recent editions of works by poet and author Charles Williams, a member of the Inklings, whom she blogs about at The Oddest Inkling. That's theoddestinkling.wordpress.com. We're really excited to finally get the chance to meet her virtually today. So, Sørina Higgins, let me be the first to say welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I should greet you all in Charles Williams fashion, under the mercy.
Ah, wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us, Sørina. We always like to start our guests off with sort of a softball question about how they discovered Tolkien's work when they read it for the first time and so on. But you're more than just a Tolkien scholar. You're an Inkling scholar with a particular interest in Charles Williams. So maybe the question we should ask you is, what was your first exposure to the work of the Inklings?
I believe my first exposure was quite a common one, which was my dad reading me the Narnia Chronicles when I was very young. And then I reread them probably almost annually and went from there to The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, to Lewis's Space Trilogy, and on from there. I did not discover Charles Williams until after my undergraduate studies. And that was one of those mind-blowing, life-changing experiences when I read The Place of the Lion for the first time.
Wow. Great.
Sean, you just froze up there.
I did. I was like, Place of the Lion. I haven't heard of that one before. I'm okay. I'm sorry. I was making a mental note to myself.
Don't worry. I know. I was too, but it's all right.
I might be doing that a lot because I just read Carpenter's book on the Inklings, and I was reading the stuff about Charles Williams, and I was like, this guy's really interesting. I need to know more about this guy. I know just the person who can tell me more. But anyway.
Yes, you do.
Well, almost anything you ask about Charles Williams, if we go long enough, we'll get to one of those awkward pauses.
Very good.
I think we're also, and you probably know this is our first time back in front of the mic since we talked to Tom Shippey.
Since Mythmoot.
Which was like 6 weeks ago. So
yeah.
It's been a little while. Our hiatus has left us rusty.
I'm still shaking some of the dust off. I'm really sorry.
That's
Don't worry
fine,
about
no problem.
I think the next question I have here on my list is, so Alan mentioned in the intro, you're the chair of the Department of Language and Literature at Signum University, where we have many friends. I'd like to ask, how'd you get involved with Signum?
I got involved, again, in a sort of typical way, a way that many people do, which is one day I thought, I love podcasts. Let me see if there are any podcasts about Tolkien. And I just started searching around, and I found Tolkien from Oxford, and I found many other wonderful podcasts, and I found the Tolkien Professor.
Right.
And I stumbled across Corey Olsen's podcast right about when Signum was getting started. So when he was moving from the more casual Tolkien professor and putting some of his classes on air, and when he was starting to offer more and more rigorous courses.
Yeah.
And then the following year, I was able to go to Mythmoot 2 at that time.
Okay.
And it then started teaching at Signum, and then took over running the language and literature department shortly after that.
Wow.
That's great. It's grown a lot in that time, I gather, just from going to Mythmoot 5. It just seemed, talking to people about the early Mythmoots, like Mythmoot 1 and 2, and just what it's turned into now. It has. It's pretty exciting.
The university has grown a lot in numbers, but even more in content and in both academic rigor and outreach to people outside of academia, to passionate fans, to engaged readers, to all kinds of people. But there are exciting things happening at Signum right now. I'm glad to see we have so many more regional conferences going on.
Yes.
Yeah. That's great. Maybe this is a tough question, but what's been the most exciting for you in terms of seeing either the growth in the academic offerings or the larger growth? What's been the most exciting thing for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can actually think of 3 things if that's not cheating.
Please, go ahead.
One is that the graduate school is moving through its credentialing process, which is very exciting to me from an administrative point of view. That's not as flashy as, costume contests and book publications and so forth, but it's very important. Eventually, we would like to be able to guarantee that our graduates are going to be able to use what they've learned at Signum throughout mainstream academia.
Yeah.
And connected to that is I am very, very proud of our graduates. To date, we have graduated 19 people with a Master of Arts in Language and Literature, and a couple have gone on for PhDs, and many of them are teaching in a variety of places and modes, publishing, presenting at conferences, and working in some ways as public intellectuals as well as educators themselves.
That's great.
And then I mentioned the regional conferences as well. Since we're a fully online university, it's wonderful when we get to meet in person. As you guys know, I hear you just met in person for the first time at Myth 5, right?
That was our first time, yes.
That's amazing.
Yep. It was pretty cool.
You must have had that shock because you know someone just by their voice for so long.
Well, I'd seen him on some a couple of our video episodes. And,
we'd done some video stuff.
Some Facebook Live events.
And I don't know, we've worked so closely together.
Yeah,
I would say we worked so closely together for the last 2 years. I kind of felt like I don't know, it didn't feel that strange to me at that point.
It was like, oh, hey, it's you. How you doing?
It was amazing meeting some of our listeners. That was really cool.
Yeah.
That was cool. That's really great. Was. It was such a neat opportunity. And just to be able to be together at an event like that. With the Tolkien community that we've just grown to love so much over these years.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
It's the same for me, meeting my fellow faculty members, staff members at Signum, and of course, students and alumni.
Yeah.
So I'm on the team that organizes the North Central Annual Texas Language and Literature Symposium, fondly known as TexMoot. And we had our first TexMoot this past January, and I'm just now working on starting to get the coming TexMoot for this next year, and I'm very excited about that.
Excellent.
That should be great.
I will be watching that one closely. I will do my best to make this one.
Excellent. I wonder, I could probably give a spoiler on the theme for that since...
Okay, please do.
Certainly, sure.
All right. Well, the theme is going to be Around the Talkative Planet. We're looking at orality and aurality, literature for the ear, not for the eye. And podcasting is going to be pretty high up on our list of topics in the call for papers.
It sure would, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Oh, my.
Fascinating. I love that.
Okay.
I might have to find a way to get out of
That's good to know.
We'd love to have you both.
That's good to know. Alan, maybe you can come and stay with me, and we can drive up there.
Yeah, if it's not too far. I mean,
let's talk about this seriously, because maybe we could do an episode from there or something like that.
That's something to think about. Once we have some more information, like dates and all. Oh, you probably already have that.
We could chat about that off air.
Sounds good.
Great.
We'll do that. For now, let's go ahead and move on and talk about the Inklings and King Arthur. It's a wonderful collection of 19 essays from various contributors that you edited. Of course, you also wrote the first essay in the book. And it covers the many retellings of and references to the Arthurian legend that are written by the 4 main Inklings. Everybody knows Tolkien and Lewis, but also Charles Williams and Owen Barfield. Of course, now the book's the winner of an award for the Mythopoeic Society, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations for that.
Thank you.
But my question is, what was the inspiration for this collection? Why now? What motivated you to put that together?
Right. The inspiration was very specifically the publication of Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur in the spring of 2013. Yeah. As soon as I got that book, the minute it was published, I read it and I said, this is amazing. This means that, as far as I knew at that point, at least the 3 first Inklings you mentioned had written major Arthurian works. And then I soon found out that Owen Barfield had written some as well. And so I was talking to a couple other people, some of whom became contributors to the book, and saying, someone needs to write a book on this topic, or at least edit a collection on this topic.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, someone did.
That's awesome. And that was actually going to be my next question, was how did you find contributors for the collection? How did you all come together? It sounds like some of you are already talking about this.
Right. I sent out the call for papers and posted it anywhere I could think of in the usual places where you'll find CFPs, but also through social media. Some people I reached out to individually, people whose work I knew or whom I had met at a conference, and asked them very specifically, will you write a chapter on your area of expertise. And then I had to reach a little further for some of the other chapters. For instance, I wanted more on T.S. Eliot in the book. We did not get a specific chapter on Eliot and the Inklings and Arthur, but he does come into the chapter about Narnian imagery and wastelands.
That's right, yeah. Right.
So it was through a variety of just open call for papers, networking, and individual requests.
Okay.
So once you've got all that out there, how do you decide, what to include? Obviously, you had some ideas in mind of things that you wanted to include, and I know that the collection's arranged by themes. Did you start out wanting to pursue certain themes, or did themes just sort of emerge as you received papers and worked through them and edited the collection?
There was definitely some of each of those. I had themes in mind beforehand to such degree of detail that I wrote out a possible outline for the book. I think I may have included it in the call for papers or at least on a blog post or something. And at that point, I was really interested in geography, in fantastical Arthurian geography, because I noticed that each of our authors was either revising the geography of England and Europe in their Arthurian works and or creating fantastical subcreative geographies. So I knew I was interested in that. I also wanted to look at what were the similarities and overlaps among their Arthurian works. Could there be such a thing as a composite Inklings Arthuriad if you layered all these works together?
Right.
Yeah.
And then somewhat more open-ended, I knew that I wanted this to be a very rigorous academic collection that forged new paths, that looked at the Inklings' works through some of the scholarly lenses that have not been used as often. So I knew I wanted gender studies and post-colonial approaches. But beyond that, I was open to whatever people wanted to suggest. And I also wanted to balance that with it being a readable book for the avid fan who is not a professional academic as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to strike just that right tone of it being rigorous but engaging. And then, of course, as the proposals came in, other themes opened up. I didn't have the intertextuality section in mind at first, but I got very good proposals on that. And there's sort of a theme running through, too, of what was the scientific climate or culture at the time. So that came out as well. And then I got together a panel of peer reviewers, and I sent out the abstracts to them and got their feedback. And then all of the chapters, of course, were peer reviewed as well.
You talk about the desire to make it a rigorous academic work, but also approachable to the casual fan, and I really found that you accomplished that. I felt like for me, I took one. Alan and I were just talking about this. I took one Arthurian course in college in undergrad, and I mean I took several medieval studies courses, but only one on Arthur. And it's something that I've always been interested in, but I don't, I haven't studied a ton of it, and it all just made perfect sense. Everything was very clearly presented, and even only having some knowledge of a few of the Inklings, I felt like all the information was presented really well in a way that it was very approachable. So,
good. That's great to hear.
Highly recommend it to everyone, I would say.
I concur. I have even less formal training or education when it comes to King Arthur than even Sean does, just a general interest. But I found it significantly easier to approach than I thought.
Good.
I was a little intimidated. I'm like, oh man, how are we going to get? Sean, this is on you, man.
It's also a big book with a lot of polysyllabic words and technical terms.
But we love those. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I don't think I've ever been called monosyllabic. So.
Right. Oh. Yeah, I also wanted to make sure I had those first two chapters to bring in readers such as the way you describe yourself. Yeah. So mine, I try to give a quick overview of here are some of the historical periods when King Arthur stories were popular, and then here are the major themes that the Inklings put into it. And then the next chapter, Holly Ordway's, is a very straightforward survey of the major medieval Arthurian works. So I hope that those two are a way in to readers who aren't as familiar.
It was very helpful. It really helped set up a framework and make it a little easier for me to understand, especially with that lack of academic background.
Good.
And I would say it had that wonderful quality of making you want to learn more. And
it did.
That was really, really cool. I mean, that's what you strive for, right?
All right, my work here is done.
Right. So that was great.
Good stuff. Well, it's incredible to see just how frequently the Inklings touched on the Arthurian legend. Like you said in the introduction, each of the four main members, Lewis, Tolkien, Williams, and Barfield, wrote letters, poetry, fiction, or performance pieces with Arthurian elements. And then you were kind enough to include a bibliography of them all in the book, which was a tremendous resource.
Right.
Now, I know the book's full of very good answers to this question, but for the sake of our listeners, can you help us understand why the legend of King Arthur resonated so much with this group of writers?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are many possible answers to that. And I think the answers to that question overlap with another question, which is why is anyone drawn to this story over and over again? Why do we keep writing about it since perhaps even the 500s or so?
Right.
And now why are we making so many movies and video games and other media about it? There are a few possible answers. One answer is that the Inklings were in tune with what was going on in their day. So they're aware of scientific advancements and they were aware of political movements. Obviously, they lived through the 2 world wars and several of them fought in the First World War. So they knew what was going on in their own times. And they were not just in opposition to their times, but I think they were offering an alternative viewpoint to some of the more hopeless approaches. So I mentioned earlier the wasteland imagery that T.S. Eliot describes in his poem of that name and that many other poets described. Related to that is the imagery that the more common World War I poets we think of used. Wilfred Owen, those types of poets.
Siegfried Sassoon. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Great, Robert Graves. And the Inklings, they're there. You know, Lewis and Tolkien each fought in various phases of the Battle of the Somme, and they saw death and destruction. They were deeply affected by this.
Right.
And they saw the Arthurian legends, I think, as one way of dealing with that cultural trauma and that large-scale national grief. So sometimes that meant offering an heroic vision of warfare, which a lot of us now today in academia see as problematic, but they didn't necessarily see that it was always problematic. They thought that some wars could be justified and that some military action was called for and even heroic. But they also then sometimes adapted the Arthurian stories to show that hopelessness, or at least that loss and that grief. And that's something that has occasionally been overlooked, especially in the works of Tolkien. And if you look at a lot of his imagery in The Lord of the Rings, you can see where he was influenced by the war, but especially in The Fall of Arthur, this newly published work. So that's one answer. Another related answer is the Arthurian story complex as a whole is a tale of a vision that is glimpsed, a vision of this perfect kingdom on earth, this kingdom of order and chivalry, of love, and of hierarchy and equality. And we get this glimpse, and then it always fails. So it's this story that's full of longing, of C.S. Lewis's Sehnsucht or joy, or these romantic flashes. We're reaching out, we're trying to grasp something. They would have called it perhaps the kingdom of God on earth. And that we come so close to establishing that, but we never do. That human political systems and economic systems always fall short.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a lot of sense of longing in it, a sense of pilgrimage on this earth. And yet at the same time, they are offering this vision of art and beauty and military prowess and monarchy and of myth and narrative as an alternative to the meaningless vision of the high modernists.
Okay. And that's it's so interesting because, you know, some of the sorry, Alan, I'm just kind of jumping in here, but I think
please, no, it's okay. By all means.
Some of that description you just gave, Sørina, kind of reminds me of, you know, sort of the Tennyson approach to the Arthurian legend, and Tennyson coming from that very Victorian mindset of the heroic war that was so torn apart by World War I, and yet there was still an element of that. Is it that there was still sort of a thread of that in the Arthurian literature that the Inklings were drawn to, or am I misunderstanding that?
No, there definitely is. Tennyson is an interesting case, and I don't know quite enough about the relationship between Tennyson and the Inklings, but it is a little bit conflicted. On the one hand, they greatly admired what Lewis maybe would call the horns of elflands, the beauty of nature, and again, that sense of Sehnsucht. That idea of Sehnsucht in Lewis comes through the German Romantics and then the British Romantics. And there's a lot of that still remaining in Tennyson. But Williams, for instance, was kind of disgusted by Tennyson and thought that he completely misunderstood the Grail and got the tone of the whole story wrong. He says, I can't believe he would use the sacred lance as a jumping pole. But what Tennyson is trying to do, I think, is analogous to what the Inklings are doing, which is adapting the Arthurian story for the conditions of their own times.
I think I remember that observation from the book, the fact that the Arthurian legend has continually been updated or sort of restated and sort of adapted for the time in which it's being rewritten. And I guess the Inklings were no exception to that.
Yeah.
Right, that's absolutely true. The writers do whatever they need to with the material. Just one quick, simple example is depending on the tone of the times and its relationship to either empire or Roman Catholicism, you will either have Arthur attacking Rome, defeating the emperor and setting himself up as Roman emperor, or you will have him defending Rome against the invaders. That's just one simple example.
All depending on what the writers approach to Rome and Catholicism and so forth.
What current events are demanding they adapt it to.
Wow.
Yep.
That's great.
Well, I suspect the answers you gave there will also be similar to the answers to this question. But, one of the essays mentioned the phenomenon of cultural medievalism in the 20th century, sort of this interest in or adoption of medieval ideals. And I was going to ask why you thought that also struck such a chord with the Inklings specifically, but I have a feeling there's a lot of crossover between your previous kind of multiple answers and this one. Is that true?
There is a lot of crossover, and there are other answers as well. And this goes on now. It's not only the 20th century, but look at what's happening to us. Yeah, look at the great number of blockbuster hits that are
right.
Yeah, they're either medievalism or they're chivalry in some other context, or of course the superhero genre has a lot of overlap with the idea of the Knights of the Round Table, right? This collection of heroes, each of whom has his or her talents, superpowers, and so forth, and they're all trying to defend a way of life, a civilization. Well, one answer to that question is also that the Arthurian story is so eminently adaptable, and that's for a couple of reasons. One reason is that it has so many different story threads that are woven together. And an author can just pull out one of those threads and use the one that is applicable. So you can take the Tristan and Isolde tragic Romeo and Juliet love story. It's such a poignant, painful, and beautiful story. So you can just pull out that one thread and use it. Or you can go with the Merlin side of the story, the mysterious mage, the old man guide figure, the sort of Jedi master, Gandalf Dumbledore figure. You can work with that side of the story. Or you can go with the collection of knights, the adventurers, the knights errant. You can even take out just the quest and strip it of all of those other permutations. You could invert the quest and have it be a quest to lose an object instead of to gain one.
I have no idea where you're going with that.
You could focus on the women in the story and see what their position is and see, do they have power? Do they have agency in this tale? Or are they merely pawns being used by some other forces? Are they the mysterious forces behind it, such as the Lady of the Lake?
I think I read one of those too.
Right.
Yep, exactly. So that's one reason that the 20th century writers love this story and that we love it right now. But one final reason, I think, for that, and this one Tom Shippey has talked about in other places, there time and time again throughout culture, you get these eras, these moments when we need heroes and we need causes to believe in. And we need to be able to look to certain types of stories and think that there's hope for order, for civilization, for learning, for kindness, for love, and so forth. And the Arthurian story, I think, offers that in ways that maybe are similar to the way the great superhero myths do as well. And those, of course, tap into other great traditions such as Norse mythology and so forth.
Yeah.
But I think they give us beauty and pageantry as well as order and civilization.
Wow. Insightful.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go to my next question here, and it might actually kind of jump off from some of the stuff you've already said, but just a few weeks ago, I actually read Humphrey Carpenter's book about the Inklings, and I was struck by the fact that although I think there's a tendency to sort of lump all the Inklings together as Christian writers, air quotes, Christian writers, but they all had very different approaches to their religion. You've got Tolkien, the devout Catholic. You've got C.S. Lewis, I guess you could call him an Anglican polemicist.
Right.
Charles Williams, the mystic. Owen Barfield with his belief in anthroposophy, which I think would probably take a whole podcast to explain, and we would need, probably you to take the lead on that one. But But I guess my question is, how did their different approaches to their Christianity influence their different approaches to the legend of King Arthur?
Oh, thanks for asking such a good question. That's a really, really good one.
Oh, thank you.
He does that.
Yeah, very good. That's what they pay you for, right?
That's right. That's right.
I can't remember where I mention it, if it's in the intro or in the first chapter, but I say we don't actually explicitly deal in the book with, are their Inklings' works more similar or more different? We kind of leave that up to the reader to go through and look at each of these works. But you characterized it very neatly, and those differences that you mention absolutely come up in their Arthurian works. And maybe we could even get a little more specific here. We've been talking in sort of big, broad sweeps. Maybe we could dig down into specific texts, mention some particular works, perhaps.
Please, yeah.
So Tolkien, as you mentioned, being the devout Roman Catholic, it's interesting to note that he wrote very, very, very few explicitly Christian works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, he once considered using the Arthurian legends as his great mythology for England. You'd think that would be an obvious choice, wouldn't you?
And that's my next question.
The first High King, right? Uniting England.
Yeah.
But there are at least two reasons, that Tolkien eventually rejected it and didn't finish The Fall of Arthur. The first is that he thought it was way too Frenchified.
Yes.
The French, of course, for those who don't know, took up the Arthurian story in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, and wrote these great romances on it.
Yeah.
And those so highly influenced the later writers that it's very difficult to make an Arthurian work that doesn't come through the French versions of them. Mm. But interestingly, another reason that Tolkien rejected it is that he says it's too Christian.
Right.
So why would that bother this devout Roman Catholic? Well, he wanted his Christianity to come through in his stories in a way that was much more subtle and integrated, not on the surface, but down in the depths of the story. So specifically, he wanted to be able to set his legendarium in pre-Christian times.
Right.
Some of it in pre-human times. So you can't have elves saying the Lord's Prayer.
No.
Or the Hail Mary, because, chronologically they live before all of that.
Exactly.
So that the Arthurian story wouldn't work then for those purposes. And in The Fall of Arthur, he sets it back before the Frenchification of the story. Mm-hmm. So he sets it closer to what would be the historical time period of Arthur if there were an historical Arthur, which we don't really know.
Right.
So he sets it back there, and he makes it as Germanic as possible. He uses this Anglo-Saxon alliterative meter. Mm-hmm. The story, his version actually opens with Arthur on the continent, marching through Germany and actually marching through Mirkwood, of all places.
Oh, yes.
And it's got a very dark tone to it. Tolkien also avoids sort of the Celtic, bright and complicated. Picture in your mind the Book of Kells, these complicated Celtic knots. He also tries to avoid that aesthetic, which is another aesthetic that comes into the Arthurian complex of stories. So he makes it this sort of spare, dark, Germanic tale. So that's Tolkien. Thoughts, questions, comments on that before I mention one of the others?
Only that I think you've sort of predicted our next questions.
Three questions, yeah.
about the Fall of Arthur specifically, but that's great. We'll get back to those in a minute.
Yeah, that's going to be fun to dig a little deeper there, but yeah.
Very good. And was there a real Arthur? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Owen Barfield, as you mentioned, was an anthroposophist, which, without getting into it in any great detail, is a philosophy/religion/educational approach. And at the core of it is the idea, one of the ideas is that we can have communication with the divine or with another realm. And so his main Arthurian work is this fascinating piece. It's just a 16-page adaptation from Mallory and Chrétien, and it's in the Bodleian. It has not been published. And it's a work of eurythmy. Does either of you know what eurythmy is? Or did you before you?
I could probably parse out the Greek, but I'm not going to say
That's exactly what I'm thinking.
I
that's the only way I could figure it out. But no, I'd never heard of the word.
Right. What is it in Greek? Is it good movement?
Good. Yeah. I think rhythmia is movement.
Evangelium and rhythm.
Meter.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent. That makes a lot of sense. So eurythmy is a practice that is done in Steiner schools, where children are taught to do expressive gestures while a text is read or music is performed. And it specifically is not dancing, but it's these expressive gestures. And so there's a combination of freedom and then within a form that the students are asked to perform. And you can look at some eurythmy on YouTube and see not dancers, performers in these long gowns, and someone's maybe reading a text or there's music being performed. So the idea is that he wrote this adaptation to be used in Steiner schools. And he said he did not want it to be published as a work of literature. He only wanted it to have this performative element to it. And then there are 4 or 5 moments where the word music is in parentheses throughout this piece. It's called the Quest of the San Graal, by the way. And those moments where there's music seem to happen when we have sort of high spiritual significance, like a conversation with witches or the revelation of the Holy Grail. So it seems to me that by taking those pieces of evidence together, the fact that there would be movement and music, it seems that he's saying that this story is one way of getting in touch with the divine or having spiritual communication.
Interesting.
I think.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
So what about Lewis
Right. And Williams.
Sorry.
Well, Lewis.
Well, yeah. I knew you'd get to Williams. He's your guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't even have to ask that.
He's my guy. Right. Lewis is harder for me anyway to characterize as simply as I have the others. So I recommend Brenton Dickinson's chapter on intertextuality in Lewis. And then, well, there are many chapters on that, but perhaps Benjamin Sjogren's chapter on That Hideous Strength and the portions of Charles Hutter's chapter about the image of Avalon. But Jack Lewis was a jackdaw. He was a collector. He saw anything shiny that he liked, and he said, "Ooh, I'm going to put that in."
Right.
Yeah. So,
you can see that in the Narnia books.
Yeah, you can absolutely see. All of a sudden, at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children are speaking Mallory. They're talking like the knights from Le Morte d'Arthur. We have moments of chivalry. We have knights in shining armor. I think we have a significant table that is kind of a holy relic. Yep. We have a quest. We have a quest to the east, to the sunrise, and in every story we have a restoration of proper monarchy. So there are all these Arthurian themes, but That Hideous Strength is an important work. He also did write a poem about Lancelot as well, and a few other works that mention Avalon and so forth. But That Hideous Strength maybe is where we should go, because that's the book in which Merlin appears as a character. And it's sort of the perfect example of his grab bag, hodgepodge, gallimaufry approach, which Tolkien did not like.
Right.
Because you have this story that it's in the space trilogy, or better called the Ransom Cycle, but it happens on Earth. The tone is so different from most of his other works and from the first 2 books in the trilogy. It's political bureaucracy, it's academic infighting, it's a dystopian work, it's science fiction. But then you also have Merlin being brought back to life. You have Ransom fulfilling the role of the Pendragon. There's a character named Arthur Denniston, and you have this young couple who apparently are supposed to carry on the Pendragon through their bloodline. So you have things that are snatched from all different parts of the Arthurian tradition. So unlike Tolkien, he's not saying, okay, I'm going to follow this one, I'm going to set it very carefully in this one literary tradition. He's taking whatever he likes. So he throws Tolkien's Numenor in there, and he throws in Charles Williams' Logres, as well as sort of a Welsh Merlin and any number of other bits and pieces that he grabs. And he sets Avalon in a grail-shaped valley on the planet of Venus.
Wow.
I'm surprised they don't have a grail-shaped beacon to draw attention to it.
Right. Very good.
Oh,
so I didn't really...
beacon again. Sorry.
Oh, that's good.
This is what I remind you that we are more podcasters than academics. As much as we enjoy this stuff.
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive by any means.
No. It's mostly just fun voices and Monty Python jokes, pretty much.
There you go. We do those all the time.
Right. Very good. Excellent.
Sorry. And back to the show.
Oh, nice. So I'm not sure with Lewis I really addressed the way you got into this question, which was his faith. But what Lewis does in all of his stories, I think, is he takes some particular theological idea and he embodies it in the characters or in the plot or even in the setting, right? Like in Perelandra, his specific idea about Sehnsucht is embodied in the landscape. It's sensory, right? So in That Hideous Strength, he takes his concerns about reductive scientistic materialism and he embodies them, inheads them without a body. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
So he puts them into something physically in the story.
Right.
And so he also does that with a lot of his Arthurian ideas by weaving together characters and invented languages with the Merlin character.
Okay. Yeah, I think that answers that well enough for Lewis. What about Charles Williams?
Yeah, that was a bit more rambly. That wasn't as focused. Okay,
no,
Charles Williams.
That's all right. That's all right. That's great.
How much longer do we have?
Yeah. Well, we do still have a few questions. So let's see. We've got at least 4 questions on the fall of Arthur, and we've got a couple questions on Charles Williams. So we might not be able to take too long on this one.
Right. Well, why don't you break down the Charles Williams question? Ask me some more specific ones rather than me trying to give like a whole overview of here's Williams' view of Arthuriana, because he wrote the most on Arthur.
That's true.
And it was the one story of his life. I mean, he started writing about it in 1912 and he was still working on it when he died in 1945.
Yeah. Well, then let's do that, Sean. Let's come back to that when we get to the section on Charles Williams. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea.
All right. Well, for now, since we're a Tolkien podcast, we're going to go back to Tolkien. So we're going to spend some time talking about his Arthurian work, The Fall of Arthur. Now, like Sean said, you kind of predicted these questions. And so some of this is going to be rehashing some of the ground we talked about, but it'll give us a chance to go a little bit more in depth. Following on from that last question, I think most of our listeners, when they think of Tolkien's views on Arthurian legend, they think of the comment that you cited in Letter 131, which we reference all the time, about how that Arthurian legend didn't fill the void of a mythology for England.
Right.
And one of those reasons was that it explicitly contains the Christian religion. But in his own Arthurian poem, the Christian content is front and center. You can't miss it. I mean, the war between Arthur and Mordred is framed as a battle between Christian and heathen. Clearly was interested in this conflict. Why is that okay for him in his Arthur poem, but not in his Legendarium? And I think you touched on this, but I'd love to go a little more in depth.
Mm-hmm. The very simple answer is he didn't finish The Fall of Arthur. He set it aside. And I think maybe that's one reason it actually didn't work for him. And then another reason is he was trying to connect up his Arthurian attempt with his Legendarium very explicitly. So in case the listeners don't know, I'll go through this. This is very exciting. It's just in a note that Christopher Tolkien includes in the editorial matter.
And this is great because this is my next question, because you're about to say a name that I'm obsessed with. So let's just go with it.
Okay, excellent. So there's this brilliant this surprise. Okay, so he doesn't finish the poem. What's going to happen at the end of the poem? Well, he starts out the moving towards the conclusion of the poem with the traditional ending that Arthur is going to be wounded and taken off to Avalon for healing. So, okay, that's standard Arthurian fare. But then he says Lancelot is going to sail west, searching for his beloved Arthur, never to return, parentheses, Earendel passage.
Yeah.
And, when I saw that, I probably shrieked aloud, what? What are you
That's what I did
about,
when I read
Tolkien?
it. Yeah.
It's just so shocking.
Yeah.
What does he mean? And so then he has this beautiful little poem with these lines that suggest that Lancelot is going to sail into the West and come to the Undying Lands. And what, is he going to get a Silmaril bound on his brow? Is he going to sail around the earth?
Right.
What's going to happen? But then immediately you see the chronological problem, right? Because Lancelot and Arthur were alive around the year 500. This is a long time from the First Age.
Yeah.
And it's a post-Christian era. So,
and presumably Eärendil was already up there in the sky. So,
right, exactly.
That's
so
true.
We're going to have compete here with Eärendil. So I imagine that he found out he couldn't exactly weave it in precisely, and even if even if he could work out the chronology and just say, well, the Undying Lands are still there somewhere, but they're sundered. They're sundered very far from Middle Earth now. Even if he could work that out somehow, he already has the Eärendil thing. It doesn't quite weave together beautifully. So perhaps that's another reason he gave it up, because he couldn't quite bring it in to this fabric that he was weaving that kept growing and growing of his own legendarium.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
That makes, I guess
Total
that makes a lot of sense. And maybe given enough time, he might have found a way to reconcile that. Just like you can look in you can pick up any book of the history of Middle Earth and you can figure out, if he had had the time, he might have figured out how to work this into the final story. But there's a lot of that in his writing.
That was his goal, I think, was to have everything fit into the fabric of the whole story. I mean, he was trying to bring Beowulf into it. He was looking for the lost stories and the unfinished tales throughout British literature and trying to see, what is the backstory to this and what is the rest that's untold. I will tell it and I will write that backstory. And of course, for him, it was always philological as well.
Yeah.
He was always trying to connect them together by means of words. That was one of his concerns, too, was he didn't think that the Arthurian legend was English enough, by which I mean English language.
Right.
And there's your question.
So much of it is so much of it is Welsh, Latin, or French.
Yeah.
That was your question also?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my next question was about both the Lancelot stuff and this thing you're talking about now. I have in my notes
British,
here
but not English.
British but not English, and I have here, reading between the lines, I think he's saying it's too Celtic, not Germanic enough.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
Even though he did approach some other Celtic myths, there's things like Altru and Etrun, and there was
Roverandom.
There are occasional Celtic moments in the Legendarium, and Roverandom, so there are occasional Celtic moments both outside the Legendarium and inside it. Even if you look at something like Beleriand, originally starting out as Broceliande, But I guess he just never really got to the point where he was able to bring all that together, did he?
And yet, did he? Perhaps he did. And this is a very important theme throughout our collection, which is this idea of Avalon. And the idea of Avalon is this concept that there are these blessed islands in the West, whether they're connected with Garden of Eden imagery or with classical imagery of the Isle of Apples. Somehow there's something magical about these islands. And any tale of a blessed isle in the West can be traced back to or has some connections with the Irish Imrama, which are these tales of voyages to islands in the West.
Right. Yeah.
So this is, I think, a point of contact among the Inklings, that they all had this sense of longing for some other world, and they try to place that geographically in their fantastical works. And quite frequently, it's across the sea, and you have to sail to get to it. It's usually in the West, but not exclusively. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, it's in the East. But somehow you have to journey, you have to quest to try to get to this land that's distant and hard to grasp. And really, ultimately, for them, is an image of a heavenly destination.
Right. Yeah. And I think we've talked about certainly the Avalon Numenor stuff on this podcast before, going back to season 1, Alan. I think we had a little fun with Avalone.
Yes, we did
in the Akalabeth. So nice. That's great.
Nice. Well, then your listeners will love that chapter on the idea of Avalon.
Even the Imrama have come up before. We've talked
That's
about
true.
that.
Yeah,
we
have talked about those, and yeah, I haven't read too many of those, but I've kind of skimmed some of the Saint Brendan stuff that's in in the History of Middle Earth, and
that's the one.
As a fan of everything that has to do with Eärendil, I or even smells a little bit like Eärendil. I've looked at some of that stuff, and it's
what
great.
What does Eärendil smell like?
Something different than elves, I'm thinking.
Something different from elves, probably. Yeah,
but similar. It's just got that lingering aftertaste.
It smells like the night sky, just after sunset.
And the sea and apples.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Yeah, there's definitely some salt air there.
Oh, that's right.
And there's white wine, sparkling white wine.
There's an apple connection with Avalon, isn't there?
Right, there is. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, shifting gears a little bit, there's a question that we often get from listeners that want to know the best order to read Tolkien's books in. Our answers vary. We usually say The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Children of Húrin, and Unfinished Tales. And after that, you can take the deep cuts, the History of Middle-earth, on fairy stories, Monsters and the Critics, Rover Random. Where would you put The Fall of Arthur on that list? I mean, I guess another way of saying that is, when should the casual Tolkien fan consider taking on The Fall of Arthur? How much does somebody need to know about Tolkien? Or, on the other hand, how much does one need to know about Arthurian legend to get the most out of it?
That is an excellent question. Well, on the one hand, maybe you don't need to know anything, because you can take the book on its own terms. Mm-hmm. You can just pick it up and enjoy this poem, enjoy its rhythm, its very powerful nature imagery, and the rather harsh imagery of nature destroyed by war and so forth. You can enjoy the complicated figure of Guinevere, who is a fascinating woman in Tolkien's canon. So you could just read it on its own. But I would say it depends maybe perhaps which direction the reader is coming from. If the reader is coming from, I'm a casual reader, I mostly just read contemporary fiction, well, then I would say go in the way you suggested, go in through the Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. But then The Fall of Arthur could come pretty soon after that, I would say. Yeah. It doesn't have to come after the Silmarillion. It's much more readable than the Silmarillion. It has its own rhythm and a very straightforward narrative and not a huge amount of backstory. If someone is coming from the other direction chronologically, so let's say I'm talking to a medievalist right now, then jump right into it right away and even read it early if you're starting to jump into Arthurian things, because it is set way back in the possible Arthurian timeline. So if you're a listener right now who has not yet read Malory or Chrétien or Robert de Boron, then read The Fall of Arthur first and get that sort of spare account. And then later you can add on these accretions of tapestries and swords and round tables and jousting.
All these Frenchified things.
Yeah.
All this Frenchification.
How many listeners do we have in France, Sean? We should probably answer that before we say anything further.
That's true. Yeah, we probably don't. Yeah, no.
I'm probably with Tolkien.
I speak a little French. I love the French.
I love the French as well. And Tolkien was not a lover of the French language as much as perhaps he should have been. But I will say we do have a glorious chapter in here by a French scholar, Yannick Imbert, who did a really beautiful job of looking at myth and history. And his is the only chapter in the book that addresses the question of Arthur's historicity, or more interestingly, what were people thinking about Arthur's historicity at the time?
At the time. Okay, great.
When the Inklings were writing.
Right.
That's a much more important question.
Well, so I'd love to talk a little bit about Guinevere now, because one of my favorite essays in the collection was the one about Guinevere by Alyssa House Thomas. It was called Fair as Fey Woman and Fell-Minded. Yes. And that is a phrase that's used a few times in the poem to describe Guinevere. The fell-minded part of that should probably be a little bit of a giveaway for folks that she's not exactly a sympathetic character. And I think it was actually John Ratliff who made the observation, which is quoted in the essay, that Guinevere is Tolkien's least sympathetic female character.
Right behind Morwen. Sorry, I just had to go there.
Morwen's not so bad.
I know. That's why I said she's right behind Morwen.
Yeah. You know? But even with Morwen, and this is going to be true of Morwen too, because even though she is a bit villainous, she's not one-dimensional. I think, Sørina, you just said it yourself. She is a complex character. And I would love to know how Tolkien compared to the other Inklings in his portrayal of women. particularly in Arthurian legend. And I ask this question because we're starting Lord of the Rings this season, and I am getting closer. Still got a ways to go, I guess, but I'm getting closer to talking about one of my favorite characters, which is Owen.
Right. Well, that is a difficult question. Not difficult to answer, but difficult for me anyway to swallow the answer. This is a problematic area in the Inklings. The ways that they portrayed women are, shall we say, less than satisfactory in many cases. Now, Guinevere is indeed a complex character, and Alyssa House Thomas rounds up her essay by saying, Tolkien's Guinevere is impassioned and decisive, a powerful and powerfully imagined figure who never quite leaves behind the challenges of womanhood in a heroic world. And Alyssa shows this partly through some excellent source criticism. She goes through the Celtic, Germanic, and Norse sources for Tolkien's Guinevere. But she also just looks at passages in the poem where Tolkien deals with some things head on that he doesn't often deal with in his women characters. So he shows the situations she's caught in. She's torn between her husband and her lover, and then she has to flee from Mordred's advances, and there's a powerful passage of her dangerous flight through the forest. But Tolkien also looks pretty squarely at female sexual desire in this poem, just briefly, but he does allow Guinevere to wrestle with her womanhood and her passions and her problems in perhaps a more complex way than he often does in his works.
Okay.
Of course, Tolkien has often been accused of having his women just be sort of stereotypes up on pedestals, kind of angel figures, untouchable. And I think that's part of what's so good about Guinevere is that she's very human.
Yeah.
She's very flawed and yet complex. Now, you asked how does that compare to the other Inklings. So an important chapter here is the one about the Arthurian figures as Lewisian genders in That Hideous Strength, which is by Benjamin Sjogren. Interestingly, this is about Lewis and gender, but it's not exactly about Lewis and women. It's about, Benjamin argues in his chapter that Ransom has these two names in That Hideous Strength. He has these multiple roles as the Pendragon and so forth. And Benjamin looks at his different roles as being masculine and feminine expressions, not of sex, but of gender. And he has to look back into Paralandra too there to Ransom's encounter with Mars and Venus and how they are the expressions of the masculine and feminine genders. So this is a chapter that I'm sure a lot of readers will have questions about and will have differences from, because it does have a kind of essentialist view that there are, if you will, these Platonic forms of the genders. But then those get expressed in various ways. You know, a woman might be expressing masculine characteristics in one role and feminine characteristics in another role, exchanging places in the Great Dance. But there are concerns about how Lewis presents Jane Studdock in That Hideous Strength, that she's not allowed by the narrative to pursue her academic career, that her whole purpose is to be the mother of the next Pendragon. And when Merlin finds out that she's been using contraceptives, he wants to behead her. So there are a lot of problems raised by that.
Right.
And we can stop and talk about that, or we can go on to say, but none is so problematic and complex as Charles Williams.
I'd love to hear about
women.
that one. Yeah.
Yes. And I want to hear your questions about him, but I'll give sort of an introduction to Charles Williams and women first.
Great.
And buckle your seatbelts, listeners. This isn't going to be pretty. Well, it's pretty in some ways. The idea of the feminine and the idea of woman is very important to Charles Williams and is absolutely essential to his poetry, both personally and artistically. And for readers who don't know, when he published his 1938 Arthurian collection, Taliesin Through Logres, he worked with an artist at Oxford University Press, Linton Lamb, to draw this map of Europe and then to overlay this figure of a nude woman over the map of Europe. You've seen that picture?
I've seen it, yes.
Yeah. So anybody who wants to can Google Linton Lamb, Taliesin Through Logres. All of those things are hard to spell, or you can find it on my blog.
There you go.
And you'll see this image of this woman who obviously has been in a Procrustean bed because her anatomical proportions are a little off. But what Williams is doing there is he's delving into his occult training in the Hermetic secret societies in which he was an initiate and actually a master. And he's layering symbolism there. So he starts with geography and he builds this historically anachronistic fusion of the Roman and Byzantine empires. And he writes the East-West split of the church, the 1053 split of the church. He writes that out of his history. So that he has this unified Roman-Byzantine empire with England as one of its provinces. So that's the bottom layer, is geography. So he might in his poem refer to one of the provinces of his imagined empire.
Okay.
But then he layers this female figure on top of it. So he might refer to one of the provinces by the body part.
Oh my.
Oh, wow.
So he'll talk about Rome. He'll mention the heartbreaking manual acts of the Pope. Because in Rome, the Pope serves the elements of the Eucharist with his hands. So that's where the hands are.
Okay.
Oh my. Okay.
But then he layers on top of that the signs of the zodiac that are traditionally associated with the parts of the body. So he might make reference to one of those. And then on top of that, now I'm saying on top of, but I'm not sure this is an order. They're all layered together.
Yeah.
Sure.
He also uses the virtues on the Sephirotic tree, which is a Kabbalistic belief system, a Kabbalistic initiative practice of hierarchical steps of enlightenment. And the virtues on the Sephirotic tree are also associated with the parts of the body. So he might refer to the Hebrew name for one of those virtues. And by it, he might be referring to the virtue itself or the body part or the province on the map.
Oh my. Oh,
So this is very complex, and he doesn't provide a key.
So it's layer upon layer of symbolism, and you really need to have
of symbolism.
You have to have a knowledge of
all of them.
various religions
Of
of
all
the
of
world
them.
and history and everything to really understand any of the symbolism.
Right. Well, and you actually
my
have to
goodness.
have been an initiate in an occult secret society, to learn some of
That's
this
a very narrow
information.
niche. That's just a really small niche. I can see the publisher
Right.
now. This isn't going to fly, sir.
So my favorite example is that he has this line. There's a slave girl who has been put in the stocks for bad behavior, and he goes to her and he asks, "Does the Caucasian theme ache?" Now he uses the word "theme" for province, which of course gives him all kinds of poetic possibilities.
Sure.
Well, what he means when he says, "Does the Caucasian theme ache?" is your backside sore from sitting?
Oh my goodness.
Because
You
that's where the
wouldn't know
Caucasus
that.
Mountains
'Cause that's
are on
where-
the
right.
picture. Okay.
Caucasus Mountains.
Wow.
Right. Are the buttocks, and the symbol is natural physical pleasure.
My
Wow.
goodness.
Right. Yep. And then when she's willing to stand up, he says, "Make the Roman motion," meaning lift up your hands, and I'll help you stand up.
My goodness.
Wow.
Right. So you wouldn't know this without looking at the map and understanding the symbolism.
So now I understand why you waited until now to answer my earlier question about in reference to Charles Williams. Yeah. But how his faith influenced his writing. It just sounds like it would be so incredibly hard to parse in reading it.
Well, to narrow it down to a couple of ideas that are easier to grasp, he thinks of himself as the poet of affirmation. You're probably familiar with the two ways throughout Christian religious tradition, the via affirmativa and the via negativa, or the cataphatic and the apophatic ways. So the via negativa is the way that says, if we want to get closer to God, we have to free ourselves of created things. So this is the way that would say no images, no icons, instead celibacy, poverty, silence, those kinds of separations from the world and separations from hedonism.
Okay.
Whereas the affirmative way would say, no, the way we get to know God is through all this beautiful stuff that he's created and through the people that he's made in his image. So that's the way that would affirm food and fellowship and marriage and children and sexuality and art and music as ways of knowing God. So Charles Williams says that he himself is the poet of affirmation, and he models himself after Dante.
Okay.
But characterologically, he himself is tempted towards the negative way. So these are always in tension in his poetry. So he's trying to be the poet of the body. And so literally by drawing a picture of a woman over the map of Europe, he is trying to embody the kingdom of God on earth by literally taking a body and a map and putting them together. But what you then have is a naked woman subordinated in an image of empire and of imperialism.
Yeah.
So this is very problematic. And then throughout his poetry, from his early Arthurian poetry to the end, you have very disturbing images of female slavery, of subjected female sexuality, and even of violence against women. And those are specifically ways that the male subject characters are using women as steps on their ladder towards God. And Williams practiced these things in his personal life as well. He had all these young female disciples, and he practiced magical sexual rituals with them, sometimes sadomasochistic rituals, and not always 100% consensual. And he found these rituals necessary for his creative process.
Oh my.
Wow.
Right.
Well, I remember some of this being alluded to a little bit in the Carpenter book, and he kind of tiptoes around it a bit, and maybe it was because of when he was writing, or his perspective. I don't know, but wow, I had no idea.
Right. A lot of this is in Greville Lindop's recent biography. You can learn some of it from Letters to Lalage, which is his correspondence with one of these young ladies, Lois Lang Sims. So, yes, I said there would be another moment of silence after we
that would be it right there.
That'll be the one.
Yes.
My brain is thinking, how do I edit any of that? No, of course not. I mean, it's all necessary to understanding
him. Yeah,
right.
I think so.
But,
yeah.
And
it's not it's not pretty, but it's but it's there.
No.
What's disturbing to me is not so much that a guy does bad things, right? People are very, very messy. People do bad things. What's disturbing to me is not even that a male, sort of late Edwardian, early modern poet wrote poorly about women. I'm not surprised by that historically as a literary scholar.
Sure.
What's disturbing to me is that Williams not only justified it, but he made it a necessary part of his theology.
Yeah,
he actually said that this is good and that this is a ladder to God. And in his work, Outlines of Romantic Theology, he claims that this is gender neutral. So he claims that it works the same way for a woman or for a same-sex attraction or even for some other kind of passion or love, like for a hobby or for nature. But that's not really the way it plays out in his works. It's almost always the male subject putting his gaze on the subjected and possibly even violated female figure. And that's one essential feature of his Arthurian poetry, at least. Now, in the novels, it's somewhat different. And let's go to the novels now, because this is more positive. He does a better job in his novels. And they're also much easier to read, and you don't need to join the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross or the Order of the Golden Dawn necessarily.
Well, that's a good thing.
You might want to know how to read tarot cards or how to conduct a black mass to understand some of his scenes in his novels.
Goodness.
But the female figures in his novels are by and large much, much better written. They're very strong characters, and they're examples of what I call the submitted saint in his works. Another part of his theology is this idea of submitting your will to God and making yourself available to carry other people's burdens, emotionally, spiritually, and even physically. And so every one of his novels has this submitted saint character who is a beautiful, powerful character, a really, really good portrait of righteousness, of goodness. And that is hard to write. It's much easier to write villains, Even Tolkien has that passage that it's easy to write about bad times and hard things, but when there's just sort of goodness, it's harder to write about.
Right.
And the majority of those submitted saint figures in his novels are women. And they're fascinating characters because they're powerful and they have agency. And usually they use their power of choice to choose a kind of, it's hard to put this into words, a deliberate passivity. Like a deliberate receiving of what comes to them. And that's very different from subjection and lack of agency. So those characters are quite admirable, and they're good to set against the poetry and not just look at one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Wow, interesting. How many contradictions? Maybe not contradictions, but just sort of these opposing forces in his work and presumably in his mind.
Yes, and it has led to a variety of fan bases and a variety of responses in readers' reactions to the stories. Yeah. Because on the one hand, you have the sort of perhaps Lovecraftian type reader who you just really kind of, those creepy scenes for instance, the villain is walking along a street in the fog and the buildings are disappearing and he can't find this building, or a horribly creepy scene when they're attempting to marry the soul of a dead man to the body of a living person who's pinned to the floor inside a pentagram and a circle drawn on the floor. So you have sort of that fan base. But for that fan base, he's too Christian, because for him it always comes back again to the Grail, which for him is an emblem of unity with Christ. And then on the other hand, you have readers like myself in the early days when I was just reading the novels and hadn't gotten to the poetry yet, who find reading his books a devotional experience, that there's just such a beautiful picture of submission to God's will and of how that submission makes us more ourselves rather than less ourselves, and how perfection is not a static or a boring state, but a state of wild beauty and variety and of engagement with the created world and other people. And then for us, the occult materials are disturbing too. Mm-hmm.
No doubt.
And as well, he's not the best writer of the group as far as clarity and narrative and world building. He's probably the best poet as far as his ability to construct a poetic line, but he's very difficult to read. So these things together explain why he's not as popular as Lewis and Tolkien.
My goodness. Well, I know that actually kind of made me think of the question that you have that has the quotes about that Tolkien gave about Williams, including how he found his work distasteful. Now I think we have shed some light on why that might be. I mean, for a man like Tolkien to read some of those things would be incredibly distasteful.
Right. Now, the Inklings knew very little of this.
Okay.
And it makes me think of that passage of Lewis's in his introduction to Essays Presented to Charles Williams, when Lewis writes this loving portrait. He's just gushing about how much he loves Charles Williams. And he writes that Williams had this kind of charisma that everyone who met him fell in love with him. And he says, if he were a bad man, he could have done anything he liked as either a Don Juan or a charlatan. And then now I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember, but luckily he wasn't a bad man, and so he never abused his power in that way. Well, Lewis didn't know that Williams did abuse his power in many ways. But the Inklings, Tolkien and Lewis, and I'm sure Warnie Lewis and the others, were very good for Williams. He had rarely met other people who could match his intellectual level and his vast memory for quotations. And they not only matched him, but they outstripped him, especially in logic and in the rigor and systematic nature of the educations that they had received. He also came from a much poorer background than they and had not been able to finish a university education. So his education was by no means systematic, and so he doesn't have that clarity of thought. So Lewis was very good for him in many ways, career-wise too. Lewis got him to lecture at Oxford and was influential in getting him an honorary MA from Oxford.
Because he was just working at the Oxford University Press in London,
right? Yes, which is a remarkable story.
Yeah.
He started as a lowly proofreader, proofread the entire works of Tolstoy and Thackeray, and then worked his way up to become one of the senior editors who was shaping the tastes of the time through the works he was editing, through his anthologies and his introductions to works.
And then if I recall,
that's a very important, and somewhat understudied area.
Yeah, and he ended up moving to Oxford basically during World War II, right? Because
to escape from the Blitz, from the bombings in London. Yep. So we think of him as an Inkling, but he was only an Inkling for the last 6 years of his life. And yet those were the 6 most productive years of his life.
Well, and I guess that explains why Tolkien was Tolkien. I went back through some of Tolkien's interviews and letters just to hear to read things that he had said about Williams, and it's really kind of all over the place, isn't it? I mean, sometimes he would say, "I didn't know him very well." Sometimes one time he said, and Alan just kind of alluded to this one, we liked one another, but I found his work distasteful. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but distasteful
and
was
absurd,
his word.
I think was the other.
And then there's...
doesn't he say that whole range of his work remained outside my sympathy?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
But then he also says he knew him well. Oh, the poem that was in actually the Carpenter book.
Yes, it is.
And I'm trying to remember.
He writes this beautiful poem about we are all following behind Charles's wain, Charles's wagon, that none of us can keep up with the quick pace of his lively mind. And he partly mocks, but also partly appreciates the gynecomorphical imagery, which is that woman over the map.
Right.
And he exclaims,
"There's a word I don't think
there's
I've never heard that word before."
Yeah, I don't think that word has appeared on this podcast before, right?
Probably not. No, we can parse the Greek on that one, too.
It may never appear again, actually, for all I know.
Right, exactly.
Unless there's something about Tolkien I've never read that I don't know about.
Yeah.
Right. But it's a really beautiful poem, and it does show how they had a very close fellowship for those years. And there are some accounts of times that they went to dinner together and the conversations that they had, and they were very good friends for those few years, even if Tolkien was somewhat suspicious. But Tolkien did not know that Williams had spent 3 periods as a master of the temple in the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, and perhaps spent 20 years in an offshoot of the Order of the Golden Dawn practicing tantric sex rituals. Tolkien did not know these things.
No.
And maybe that's the context
Williams
we need.
had left them. Yeah, and perhaps Williams had left them behind by that point. We're not quite certain. He definitely had left the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross as early as 1927. He didn't go to Oxford till 39. It seems that perhaps he was in the other more casual group that we don't know very much about, perhaps right up until he went to Oxford, but maybe it had become more intellectual inquiry at the time. But some of the other relationships with the young female disciples were still going on when he was in Oxford.
Wow.
Now, you'll notice that we got Williams's life mixed up with his works far more in this conversation than with the others.
Yeah.
And I find that impossible to avoid. I'm fully aware of all the dangers of biographical criticism. And yet Williams himself did it both ways. He wrote his life into his works, and he wrote his works into his life.
Yeah,
he gave
really
everyone around him nicknames from parts of his mythology, and then he treated them as if they were those characters in those roles from his mythology. Right. And he did this to every group that he was in except the Inklings.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Maybe
it seems that,
did he feel more in a sort of a company of equals, or maybe even, as you were kind of saying, maybe they were his superiors in lots of ways, and maybe he wasn't used to that.
They were the strongest group he was ever in as far as their academic credentials, their Christian commitment, and the amount of time they had already spent building their particular fellowship together. So he was sort of the newcomer to that, and I believe they were a very good challenge for him.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I think you've answered my question about his Williams's work and his relationship to Tolkien. Alan, you want to go to...
Well, yeah. Most of our listeners who haven't read Charles Williams yet are going to want to now, or maybe they don't want to, depending on their take of what you just said. But if they are interested, where should they start? I know you've got a reader's guide on the blog, but tell us a little about one or two of his more accessible works.
Yeah, I do have a reader's guide on the blog, so people should check that out, again, depending on their background and favorite genres. And please, everyone, do give him a read, even knowing this disturbing material. His novels are magnificent, and his poetry is very, very powerful. Some have said that it is among the best poetry of the 20th century, or at least the first half. Now, that might be an exaggeration.
That's pretty bold,
but it is very powerful poetry, and it's in fascinating dialogue with the modernists. I mean, you should read Williams and Eliot side by side. They had sort of parallel careers in a lot of ways, and they were good friends. But to back up and answer your question specifically, I recommend starting with the novel War in Heaven. which is his Grail novel. And it's the novel that has something most closely resembling a plot. So that's helpful.
Most closely resembling. Yeah, that would be.
Plots are handy. They're good to have. Sure.
Yeah, they are. It has a wonderful opening line. It starts out as a murder mystery and then turns into a Grail quest. It's absolutely delightful. And it does have some very creepy scenes in it, but it's very accessible in terms of just what's happening in it and the way the characters are described and so forth. The prose is more accessible in it than in some of the others. And then I recommend reading Many Dimensions next, which is actually a sequel to War in Heaven. It's one of the same characters. And from there on out, you can pretty much read any of the rest of the novels. I do have a recommended order. My favorite novel is probably The Place of the Lion, which is this magnificent tale of the Platonic archetypes manifesting themselves as gigantic animal forms and absorbing all of creation little by little. And an Adamic figure has to step in to save the world from destruction.
Wow.
So it's a beautiful story. There's also a warning in it to people in academia who approach their scholarship as merely a field and not a way of life or a path of truth.
Oh, interesting.
Wow.
Okay.
But most critics agree that Descent into Hell is actually his best novel. And this is a very strange one and not as immediately accessible, but very rewarding. And it especially rewards careful rereading. And I think Descent into Hell takes his signature ideas and embodies them the most clearly. So there's a doppelganger in it. There's a play being rehearsed and performed that's sort of a center of magical power. There's a succubus and a Lilith figure. And there's a suicide and a martyr being saved after death. And perhaps most memorably, there's a ritual of substitution and exchange, which we haven't talked about yet. But it's so central to his thought that you should have it in your mind for his Arthuriana as well. I mentioned briefly before that he believed people could carry each other's burdens, whether emotional or spiritual or physical. Right. And he meant that very, very literally. So he meant that, if you two gentlemen sat down together and one of you said, I have this terrible grief, my loved one died and I can't handle this. Well, then the other of you could say, I contract to carry that for you. And the grieving one would cease to feel burdened by it. And the other would sort of be a conduit by which the burden was passed along to Christ, I guess. Williams doesn't say that exactly explicitly, but he does definitely connect it to the atonement and to the Christian story. And this gets played out in Descent into Hell, but the character who offers it makes it very clear to say it doesn't matter whether you accept the Christian story or not. This is just the way the universe is made, and you don't have to phrase it in religious terms. So I recommend the novels. The poetry is magnificent but difficult. And then we have not talked about, he wrote several other genres. He wrote theological works that a lot of people love. And he also wrote plays. He was known mostly as a playwright in his time. He wrote one of the Canterbury plays the year before T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. And Eliot was there and saw the play, and they talked about each other's performances. And that's a brilliant play. And he wrote some Christmas plays and some pageants and just a wide variety. And they read very well aloud, and I'd like to see revivals of performances of these plays.
Cool.
Okay.
I'll have to look into those.
So there's a little overview of some aspects of Charles Williams. There's a lot more in the book, and there's a lot more on his Christianity and especially his Eucharistic theology in the book that I haven't talked about, and a little on his vision of empire. So there's much more for your readers to explore in The Inklings and King Arthur.
Excellent.
Good. Well, we would definitely recommend the work to them, and we hope that they will dive in and enjoy all the Inklings, actually.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, we've barely talked about Barfield, which is what always happens.
I know.
Poor guy.
I know.
Nobody ever talks about
Barfield. We've mentioned him a few times, but not much. So, Sørina, if you met someone on the street who's never heard of King Arthur before, or any of the story, never heard of Guinevere, Lancelot, Merlin, I know it sounds extremely unlikely, but theoretically, and you wanted to introduce them to the story for the first time, which of these works would you recommend they start with? J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur, Charles Williams's Taliesin through Logres, C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, or Monty Python and the Holy Grail?
Sorry.
Is there an E, none of the above?
You can answer.
Well, sure.
Sure.
We always
can do
an
E.
option.
Of those choices, oh dear.
Yeah, well, we ask hard questions on this show.
I was trying to kind of load it towards one, but I won't say which one.
Well, I can obviously
sure
tell
you
which
were.
one. And of those four, I'm afraid it would have to be Monty Python, and I'm going to hate myself for saying that. Well, the reason I say that is because none of the other works give enough of an overview of the Arthurian material, right? They draw on it for their own purposes.
Right.
They are very much adaptations.
Yeah.
Of those, That Hideous Strength is the most readable, but it's very strange, and it only uses Merlin. Right,
Yeah.
The Arthurian poetry uses the widest scope of Arthurian imagery and characters, but it's very difficult to read. And someone on the street who's never heard of King Arthur, unless they're coming from a different culture and they're very familiar with their own literary tradition, would find it difficult to read. And The Fall of Arthur, again, it's trying to strip the Arthurian story back. Oh, so maybe The Fall of Arthur. Maybe that's not a bad place to start, because again, you can start there with that dark Germanic tale and then move forward to the later English and French versions.
Well, that'll work for our audience. So,
Yeah, I was going to say, it's never a bad answer to give Tolkien as
People
the
on
answer.
your show.
Right, exactly.
I was hoping your last option was going to be The Sword and the Stone.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
Because that's
a
the place
great
to
choice.
start.
Yeah,
There you
that's,
go.
That's probably
That
the
works.
best one.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Sørina. We really have
thank you
truly
so much.
enjoyed our conversation. It was so much fun.
It was,
and we've learned
yeah.
a
It's been
lot.
really delightful.
I've learned more about Charles Williams than I probably cared to know, actually.
If you ever wanted to know, let me know if you want to do a whole Charles Williams show sometime.
There you go. We genuinely appreciate the time you've given to us and to our listeners. You've been really generous with that, and we appreciate it. We'd be happy to have you back on the show anytime.
Oh, I'd love to come back again, talk about anything you guys like.
All right.
Great.
Sounds good. Well, thank you again, Sørina Higgins. And listeners, that wraps it up for another episode. But please be sure to join us again next week when we get back to The Lord of the Rings.
That's right, folks. Our next episode is going to begin Chapter 3 of Book 1, 3 is Company.
But you've got a whole week to read that chapter before that episode comes out. So before you do, go check out Sørina's blog at theoddestinkling.wordpress.com. There you'll find information about Charles Williams, as well as news about the new book, The Inklings and King Arthur. And be sure to check out the new Prancing Pony Podcast themed t-shirts that we've just made available.
And hoodies. Don't forget the hoodies.
Yeah.
Folks, back in episode 100, we announced the big news that we will be recording a live episode at Tolkien 2019 in Birmingham next year. Well, we've got some great newly designed t-shirts and hoodies available for you, but you'll have to order soon.
That's right. This is a limited time campaign, and it will run until December 2nd at 11:59 Eastern Standard Time. So be sure to check out our social media for links to the new Prancing Pony Podcast gear.
We really do hate ending it that early. We'd wanted to run it for another week or two, but that was the only way to ensure that you'll get your stuff by Christmas. So please make sure you get on there and order it before the 2nd. It's a great new design, too. It's Schrodinger's Dwarves. You're going to love it. It's available in both men's and women's, basic and premium tees, and hoodies as well.
And before we wrap up, we want to ask you to consider joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. That's our family of supporters over at Patreon. We've set up a couple of really fun new goals, so check it out at patreon.com/prancingponypod.
And you'll get access to exclusive content like a full-length bonus episode every quarter and short postscripts to most episodes all the way back to the beginning of season 2. I say most because we don't do them for our interviews, but for all of our chapter walkthroughs, there's a postscript for every one of those. There's also another way you can help out. You can shop for your Tolkien books from our official library page at theprancingponypodcast.com. We put together a set of links to every Tolkien book we've ever mentioned on the show and to The Inklings and King Arthur, edited by Sørina Higgins.
You can also give us a hand by posting a review on iTunes. This increases our visibility, which means new listeners, more great questions for Barliman, more discussion on social media, and a more vibrant Tolkien community.
And don't forget to share us on social media. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, MySpace, wherever you hang out and might find Tolkien fans. So probably not that last one. Tell them about our show.
Thanks again for listening and for making the Common Room on Facebook such a fun place to spend time. We want you all to be a part of this conversation, and it doesn't stop when the episode ends. So see the comments, questions, corrections, and sometimes the raging debates on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
wings, no wings, wings, no wings. And a special thank you to our patrons at the Keir Dance contribution tier. That's DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, and Emily in Texas. Thank you all so very much.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, pictures of you posing with your copy of the Inklings and King Arthur to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll send them to Sørina and try to get them into our next episode. Well, folks, however long we've had, and I really don't know at this point, it's been still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time,
farewell, friends.